In 1990, three brothers vanished while exploring an abandoned train. One moment they were just boys on an adventure, and the next they were gone without a trace. The town searched for weeks, but it was as if they were swallowed whole by the rusting, forgotten world of the rail yard. For 22 years their disappearance became a ghost story, a wound that would never heal for the families left behind. But then their former classmate finally admits what he knew this whole time. He wasn't just a friend from school, he was with them that day. He saw something so terrifying it sent him running home, a secret he buried deep inside for over 2 decades. What could a young boy have witnessed in that rail yard that was powerful enough to buy 22 years of silence? Subscribe now, so you won't miss similar chilling stories on our channel in the future. And tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love seeing where our audience tunes in from. The air in the basement of St. Jude's Church always smelled the same, of mothballs, yellowed paper, and a faint, sweet hint of decay. For 22 years, that scent had been the backdrop to the annual town memorial for the Reed brothers. Claire Donovan moved between folding tables piled high with the ghosts of other people's lives, chipped teacups, faded tablecloths, sweaters that had lost their shape. A rummage sale to raise money for a plaque that felt more like a tombstone. She wasn't looking for anything, not really. She was just going through the motions, a quiet ritual of remembering Daniel, Matthew, and Christopher. They were boys frozen in time, forever chasing the echo of a train whistle down at the old abandoned rail yard. She could still see their faces in her high school yearbook, full of the kind of thoughtless confidence that only belonged to the young. Then she saw the box. It was a simple cardboard box, sagging at the corners, tucked beneath a table of mismatched shoes. On the side, written in faded black marker, was a single word that made the air go thin in her lungs: Reed. It wasn't a question of if it was them. In a town this small, a name like that was a landmark. Her hand trembled as she pulled it out. You know that feeling, when you touch something you shouldn't, a mix of dread and undeniable curiosity. The box was light. Inside, there was nothing but a mess of childhood junk, a worn baseball with the stitches coming undone, a handful of colorful marbles, a dog-eared comic book. It was heartbreakingly ordinary. Claire felt a fresh wave of grief, sharp and sudden, for the lives they never got to live. She started to close the lid, to push the box back into the shadows where it belonged, but her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. Buried beneath the comic book was a train whistle. It was heavy, made of tarnished metal, the kind a real conductor might have used a lifetime ago. It was rusted in spots, the kind of deep, angry rust that only came from years of being left to the elements. She turned it over in her palm, feeling its solid, sad weight. And that's when she saw the engraving. Tiny letters, scratched crudely into the side as if with a pocket knife. At first, she couldn't make them out in the dim light. She held it closer, tracing the lines with her fingertip, and then she saw it. A date. October 14th, 1990. The blood drained from her face. That date was impossible. It couldn't be right. Daniel, Matthew, and Christopher Reed had vanished on October 6th, 1990. The whole town knew that. The search parties had scoured the rail yard for weeks. The official story, the one everyone had accepted to allow their hearts to scab over, was that the boys had gotten lost deep inside the labyrinth of rusting train cars and had never, ever come out. But this whistle, this solid piece of evidence in her hand, told a different story. It screamed that they had come back. They had been alive for at least 8 more days. The truth she thought she knew dissolved into smoke, and in its place 100 terrifying questions bloomed. A tiny seed of hope, fragile and dangerous, began to sprout in the barren soil of her grief. For the first time in 22 years, the story had a new page. Later that afternoon, the town gathered in the small park beside the church. The memorial was always the same. Mayor Thompson would say a few empty words about community and loss. A few old friends would share a sanitized memory, and Thomas Reed, the boy's father, would stand silently near the new stone plaque, his face a mask of granite, accepting condolences he clearly didn't want. He was a man hollowed out by waiting. Today, Claire felt the weight of the train whistle in her coat pocket. It felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. She listened to the platitudes, the gentle murmurs of a town that had learned to live with its ghosts, and she felt a surge of anger. They were all lying to themselves. They had built a comfortable story around an unbearable truth, and that story was wrong. When the mayor finished speaking, and a respectful quiet settled over the crowd, Claire stepped forward. Her heart was a drum against her ribs. This was a mistake. You could feel it in the shifting weight of the onlookers, in the way the air suddenly felt charged. It was the wrong place, the wrong time. But the memory of Daniel Reed's lopsided grin, of him once telling her half-jokingly after a scary movie, "If we ever vanish, Claire, make sure someone tells the truth," propelled her forward. She pulled the whistle from her pocket, holding it up for all to see. "I found this today," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "In a box of the boys' things. There's a date on it. October 14th. A gasp rippled through the crowd. But it wasn't a gasp of hope or intrigue. It was a gasp of shock, of outrage. And then she saw Thomas Reed's face. The mask of grief shattered, replaced by a dark, terrible fury. He stormed toward her, his eyes blazing. "What do you think you're doing?" he snarled, his voice low and menacing. He wasn't just angry, he was something deeper. He was terrified. Putting on a show? Digging all this up again for what? A little attention? He snatched the whistle from her hand, his knuckles white. "My boys are gone. They're gone. This is a toy. It means nothing." He looked at the crowd, his gaze sweeping over his neighbors, daring them to side with her. She should be ashamed, bringing this circus to this place. Some things are better left buried, you hear me? They are better left alone. The venom in his voice was so potent, it made Claire flinch. He wasn't just dismissing her, he was warning her. The townspeople looked away, their faces shutting down. They sided with the grieving father. Of course they did. It was easier than confronting a 22-year-old lie. Claire stood there, utterly alone, the silence of the crowd, a deafening roar in her ears. She had offered them a thread of hope, and they had thrown it back in her face. As Thomas Reed stalked away, clutching the whistle in a fist, Claire felt a cold certainty settle in her bones. His anger wasn't just grief, it was fear. He wasn't just protecting his heart, he was protecting a secret. She watched him go, the promise she made to a dead boy echoing in her mind. The truth wasn't buried in the railyard, it was buried right here, in the heart of this town, and she knew with a chilling sense of purpose that she was the only one left willing to dig. The shame from the memorial clung to Claire like damp wool. In her own town, among people she'd known her entire life, she had been publicly branded a troublemaker, a woman picking at a scar everyone else had agreed to leave alone. Thomas Reed's words echoed in her head, hot and cruel. Some things are better left buried. For a long, sleepless night, she almost believed him. Maybe this was a grief too sacred to touch. Maybe she was just making everything worse. But then she would remember the cold, hard weight of the whistle and the impossible date scratched into its side. A lie had been told, and it had been poisoning their town for 22 years. She couldn't unknow that. The boys deserved the truth. Her promise to Daniel was a quiet, stubborn fire in her gut that refused to be extinguished. She knew she couldn't do this alone. If she was going to retrace their last steps, she needed someone who remembered those days not as a town tragedy, but as a real, living Tuesday. There was only one person she could think of. Lydia Marsh lived in the same small house she'd grown up in, a place that seemed to exist outside of time. It was a museum of gentle things, dried flowers in mason jars, stacks of old books, and the constant comforting smell of Earl Grey tea. While Claire had moved away and come back, Lydia had stayed, a quiet anchor in the shifting tides of their small town. When Claire called, Lydia's voice was a balm of immediate, unquestioning warmth. "Come over," she'd said, and there was no judgment in it, only welcome. Sitting in Lydia's sun-drenched kitchen, Claire felt a piece of her fractured courage begin to knit back together. She told Lydia everything: the box, the whistle, Thomas Reed's terrifying anger. Lydia listened, her brow furrowed in concentration, her empathy a physical presence in the room. She didn't tell Claire she was crazy. She didn't tell her to let it go. Instead, she stood up and said, "Wait here." She returned a few moments later carrying a heavy navy blue book with a faded silver crest on the front, the Northwood High School yearbook from 1990. You know that feeling when an old friend shows you a piece of your shared past you thought was lost forever? It was like that. A wave of bittersweet nostalgia washed over Claire. Lydia opened it carefully, the spine cracking in protest. The pages were filled with the faces of ghosts, kids with bad haircuts and hopeful eyes, utterly unaware of the futures waiting for them. And there they were, the Reed brothers. Daniel, the oldest, with that cocky, handsome grin. Matthew, the thoughtful one, staring seriously at the camera. And little Christopher, a freshman, looking both excited and terrified to be in the big school. It was like seeing them breathe again. "I could never get rid of it," Lydia said softly, her finger tracing Daniel's jawline. After, I just kept it." But it wasn't just a yearbook. As Lydia turned the pages, Claire saw that the margins were filled with tiny, scribbled notes in Lydia's neat cursive. Inside jokes, arrows pointing to secret crushes, song lyrics. It was a secret history of their lives, written in blue ink. And then Lydia stopped on the page for the junior class. She pointed to a small, almost invisible annotation next to Daniel Reed's photo. A time. 3:15 p.m. "That's when we got out of school," Lydia whispered. He had football practice, but it got canceled that day. Coach was sick. And tucked into the crease of the page, so thin it was almost invisible, was a fragile rectangle of faded cardstock. Lydia used her fingernail to gently pry it loose. It was a train ticket stub. Not a passenger ticket for a cross-country journey, but a simple ticket for the local commuter line that ran twice a day to the next town over. The date was stamped in faint purple ink. October 6, 1990. The time? 3:47 p.m. Claire's heart leaped. This was it. This was a piece of their last day, a tangible clue held in her hands. The boys hadn't gone straight to the railyard. They had gone to the train station first. It was a small detail, but it was everything. It was the first solid thing she had learned in 22 years. Hope, bright and powerful, surged through her, pushing back the shadows of fear and doubt. Their next stop seemed obvious. If anyone remembered the strange schedules of an old commuter line or the boys who used to hang around the station, it would be Mr. Abernathy, their old history teacher. He had been a railroad enthusiast his entire life. He lived just a few blocks away, in a house that seemed as old and stooped as he was. When he opened the door, he looked ancient, his skin as thin and translucent as onion paper. But his eyes lit up with recognition when he saw them. Claire Donovan and Lydia Marsh. My, come in, girls. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and old books. He shuffled them into his study, a room where history seemed to have physically collected in tall, leaning towers of books. At first, he was happy to reminisce, sharing fond stories of the Reed boys, of their energy, their endless questions. But the moment Claire mentioned the train station and the ticket stub, the warmth in the room vanished. It was like a window had been slammed shut. Mr. Abernathy's friendly smile tightened into a thin, pale line. His grip tightened on the head of his wooden cane. "The rail yard," he said, his voice suddenly brittle. "You girls shouldn't be asking about that place." He looked from Claire to Lydia, and the kindness in his eyes had been replaced with something else, a deep, settled fear. "What happened to those boys was a tragedy," he continued, his gaze flicking toward the window as if checking for eavesdroppers. "A terrible, terrible tragedy. And it's over. It's in the past." "But Mr. Abernathy," Claire pressed, holding out the ticket stub, "this proves they were at the station. We're just trying to understand their last day." He wouldn't even look at it. He shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "Let sleeping things lie, Claire," he whispered, his voice cracking. It wasn't advice. It was a warning, a plea. He leaned forward, the smell of mothballs suddenly overwhelming. "That railyard has been sealed up for 20 years for a reason. Vernon Hale made sure of that." The name dropped into the quiet room like a stone. Vernon Hale. Councilman Hale. The man who had built his entire political career on being the town's safety advocate, the one who pushed for higher fences, more streetlights, and a zero-tolerance policy for trespassing. He had personally championed the permanent closure of the railyard, calling it an attractive nuisance. Now, hearing his name spoken with such terror in this dusty room, Claire felt a chill snake down her spine. The official story was that Hale had sealed the yard to prevent another tragedy. But what if he was sealing it to hide one? They left Mr. Abernathy's house with the ticket stub feeling less like a clue and more like a curse. The hope that had bloomed in Lydia's kitchen had wilted under the cold frost of the old teacher's fear. As Claire drove home, every shadow seemed to stretch a little longer. Every pair of headlights in her rearview mirror felt like a threat. The world that had felt safe and familiar that morning now felt menacing, full of locked doors and watchful eyes. That night, just as she was about to fall into a restless sleep, her phone rang. The number was blocked. She hesitated, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "You know you shouldn't answer. You know nothing good comes from a call like this." She answered anyway. There was a long moment of silence, just the faint hiss of an open line. Then, a voice spoke. It was distorted, electronic, like gravel and static being ground together. It wasn't a voice at all, it was the absence of one. "You have no idea what you're stepping into," it rasped. "Stop now." The line went dead. Claire stood in the darkness of her kitchen, the phone still pressed to her ear, her own ragged breathing the only sound in the house. The threat wasn't a memory anymore. It was here. It was now. And it knew her name. The distorted voice on the phone had warned her to stop, but fear can be a strange kind of fuel. Instead of paralyzing Claire, that mechanical threat lit a fire in her belly. They were scared. Whoever was hiding the truth was finally, after 22 years, afraid of being found out. And that meant she was close. The town was a closed door, she realized that now. Thomas Reed, Mr. Abernathy, they were all locked tight by grief or terror. She needed a key, someone who knew the bones of that railyard but wasn't bound by the town's polished silence. She needed someone on the outside of the inside. She found him in a small, neat bungalow on the edge of town, where the pavement gave way to gravel. Gus Miller had worked the yards for 40 years before the closure, a union man with knuckles scarred from decades of hard labor and a gaze that didn't flinch. He was scheduled to consult on the final demolition starting next week, and he was her only shot. Convincing him wasn't easy. He stood on his porch, arms crossed, looking at Claire with the weary skepticism of a man who had seen too many people try to fight the company and lose. But when she told him about the whistle, about the date scratched into the rust, something shifted in his eyes. He didn't look surprised. He looked validated. "They always said those boys just got lost," he muttered, spitting into the azalea bush. "Nobody gets lost in my yard unless someone wants them to stay lost." For the first time since finding the box, Claire felt a wave of pure, clean hope. She had an ally. He met her at the perimeter fence just as the sun was beginning to bleed into the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. The massive sign that read, "Danger, keep out, property of the municipality, by order of Councilman Vernon Hale," seemed to loom over them like a judgment. Gus produced a heavy set of bolt cutters, not for the chain, that would be too obvious, but to pry up a section of the fence that had been undermined by years of erosion. "Technically I ain't cutting nothin'," he said with a wink that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Quickly now, I'm supposed to be checking the perimeter for the demo crew. You got 20 minutes. Claire slipped under the cold metal chain link, the rust scraping against her jacket. When she stood up on the other side, the silence hit her like a physical blow. It was a forbidden kingdom. A graveyard of American steel. Towering hulks of decommissioned train cars stood in long, mournful rows, like sleeping giants that would never wake up. The wind whistled through the gaps in their rusted flanks, a sound that felt too much like the ghosts of children laughing. It was awe-inspiring and absolutely terrifying. You could see how 3 boys on an adventure could be swallowed whole by this place. You could feel how easy it would be to disappear here. Gus led her down a narrow path between 2 lines of boxcars, the ground crunchy with gravel and broken glass. "Used to be the kids had a spot," he said, his voice low, reverent almost, "back by the old water tower, before Hale locked it all down tighter than a drum. They found it, an old flatbed car, half sunk into the weeds. It wasn't just a piece of junk. It was a monument to the town's youth. Generations of kids had snuck in here to drink their first stolen beers, to share their first kisses, to dream of escaping this town. And there, carved into the flaking red paint on the side, were the marks they left behind. Initials, dates, hearts with arrows through them. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch the cold, rough metal. Her fingers traced the letters, D-R-M-R, and below them, smaller and a little less sure, C.R., Daniel, Matthew, and Christopher Reed. They had been here. This was their place. A profound, crushing sadness washed over her, so intense it brought her to her knees in the dirt. They were just boys. They had stood right where she was standing, full of life and tomorrow. She closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against the cold steel where their initials were carved. It felt like a connection, the closest she had been to them since they vanished. "I'm not giving up on you," she whispered into the rust, a prayer and a promise. "I know you came back. I'm going to find out why." For that moment, in the shadow of the dying trains, she didn't feel fear. She felt love. She felt their presence, urging her on. But the high of that connection didn't last. Gus hustled her out before her 20 minutes were up, looking nervously over his shoulder the whole time. Back in the safety of her car, the hope began to curdle into frustration. She had seen the yard. She had felt the truth of it. But she still had nothing she could take to the police. Nothing that would crack the armor around Vernon Hale and the official story. The town was walling her off. Thomas Reed hated her. Abernathy was terrified. Even Lydia, her rock, was starting to look at her with worry in her eyes. Claire felt overwhelmingly, desperately alone. She was fighting a ghost and a powerful politician, and all she had was a rusted whistle the boy's own father called a toy. Driving home that night, the frustration boiled over. It wasn't fair. They were going to demolish the yard next week. They were going to bury the last trace of those boys under tons of concrete and pretend it never happened. Again, the desperation was a physical ache in her chest. She needed help. She needed an army. If the town wouldn't listen, maybe the world would. Sitting at her kitchen table at 2 a.m, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of her laptop, Claire made a choice. It was a choice born of love, fueled by 3 cups of coffee, and a desperate need for someone, anyone, to believe her. You're screaming at her right now, aren't you? You're telling her not to do it. You know it's painting a target on her back. But you also know what it feels like when no one will listen and you have to scream to be heard. She opened a popular online forum dedicated to unsolved mysteries. Her fingers flew across the keys. She posted a picture of the rusted whistle. She typed out the date. October 14, 1990. The Reed brothers disappeared on October 6th. My town says this is impossible. They are about to demolish the evidence. Help me make them listen before it's too late. She hit post. It felt like firing a flare into the night sky. It felt like righteous defiance. For a few minutes, she felt powerful. The next morning, the illusion of power shattered. She needed to talk to Gus again, to thank him, maybe to ask him about one of the cars she'd seen near the water tower that didn't look quite right. She called his number. He answered on the first ring, but the voice that came over the line wasn't the gruff, confident union man from yesterday. It was the voice of a broken man. He was breathing hard, short, shallow gasps, like he'd been running. "Don't call me again," he hissed, the words tumbling out in a panic. "Lose this number. Do you hear me? Forget you ever met me." "Gus? What happened? Are you all right?" Claire gripped the phone, the blood draining from her face. "They know," he whispered, his voice shaking so hard she could barely understand him. "They know. I let you in. 2 men came to my house this morning. They knew about my pension. They knew where my daughter lives in Ohio. They knew everything." He paused, and she could hear him choking back a sob. "I can't help you, lady. You're on your own. You don't cross him. You don't cross Hale." The line went dead. Claire stared at the phone, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Hale. Abernathy had warned her, and she hadn't listened. Now, Gus, a tough old rail worker, was reduced to a terrified whisper. She had gotten a good man involved, and the villain she hadn't even met yet had crushed him in less than 12 hours. A notification dinged on her laptop, then another, then a cascade of them. Her post had gone viral. Thousands of comments were pouring in. Strangers were offering theories, demanding answers, tagging news outlets. She had wanted an army, and she had gotten a mob. She had wanted to be heard, and now the whole world was listening, including, she knew with a sick certainty, the people who had made that threatening phone call. She had fired her flare into the night sky, all right. And now, everyone knew exactly where she was standing. The walls weren't just closing in, they were on fire. Claire's reckless post online did more than attract attention. It shook the branches of a tree so hard that something unexpected fell out. The internet mob was a faceless, angry beast, but her story also reached people who had quietly carried their own pieces of that day for 2 decades. Late one night, an email appeared in her inbox with a simple subject line. I was there. The sender's name was Ethan Miller. Claire's heart seized. She remembered Ethan. He was the quiet boy, the one who always seemed to be watching from the edges, sketching in a notebook instead of joining the rough and tumble of the other boys. He had been friends with the Reeds, especially Christopher, the youngest. After they vanished, Ethan had withdrawn completely, becoming a ghost in the high school hallways, a boy who had already seen too much. He had never spoken a word about it to anyone. Not then, not ever. The email was short. Meet me at the old diner. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. Come alone. It wasn't a request. It was a summons from a man who had finally decided to break 22 years of silence. This was it. This was the moment everything could change. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but for the first time, it was eclipsed by a ferocious, brilliant hope. The diner was a relic, all cracked vinyl booths and the lingering smell of stale coffee and fried onions. Ethan was already there, tucked into a corner booth, hunched over a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He looked older than his years, his face etched with a permanent, weary caution. The shy boy had grown into a man who looked like he was bracing for a blow. He didn't say hello when Claire slid into the booth opposite him. He just stared at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of shame and resentment. Your post online, he started, his voice a low, raspy whisper. You have no idea what you've done. You've woken something up. His hands, which were resting on the table, were shaking. Not with fear, but with a deep, bone-rattling tremor of memory. I was with them that day, he finally said, the words coming out like he was pulling shards of glass from his throat. All of us. Daniel, Matthew, Chris, and me. We were at the railyard. Claire's breath hitched. She just nodded, letting him speak, knowing that a single wrong word could send him scurrying back into the shadows for another 2 decades. Ethan's gaze drifted to the window, but he wasn't seeing the street. He was seeing 1990. It was a dare, he said softly. Daniel's idea. There was this one car, a big sealed one, on a siding marked for the scrapyard. He said it was probably full of secret army stuff. We were going to be famous, the kids who found the government's secrets. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. We were so stupid, just kids playing heroes. He took a shaky sip of his cold coffee. We were trying to jimmy the lock on the door when he showed up. Ethan's voice dropped even lower, becoming conspiratorial, terrified. Vernon Hale. He wasn't a councilman back then, he was just a yard worker, younger, but it was him. Same face, same polished glasses. Claire felt the air in her lungs turn to ice. Hale was there. From the very beginning. He didn't see us at first, Ethan continued, his eyes wide with the remembered terror. He was shouting at someone on a walkie-talkie, angry, something about an unscheduled haul, a car that wasn't on the manifest. The Reed boys, they didn't run, they froze. But I was always the coward. The self-loathing in his voice was a raw, open wound. I ran. I hid behind a stack of old ties, and I watched. Hale saw them. He started yelling at them, telling them they were trespassing, that he was going to call their parents, call the cops. Daniel, you know how he was, he yelled right back. Mouthy. He told Hale he had no right, that his own dad worked for the railroad. And then Hale grabbed him. He grabbed Daniel by the arm, hard. Matthew and Chris jumped in, trying to pull him off. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to physically block out the memory. "That's all I saw. I just ran. I ran all the way home and I didn't stop. I told my mom I was sick. I hid in my room. I never told anyone what I saw. Not when the police asked. Not when their parents begged. I just stayed silent." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and toxic. 22 years of guilt, shame, and suffocating fear, all poured out onto a sticky diner tabletop. Claire wanted to be angry with him. A part of her, the part that had grieved for her friends, wanted to scream at the boy who ran away. But looking at the broken man in front of her, she could only feel a profound, aching pity. He had been a child, terrified and alone. And Vernon Hale had been counting on that fear to keep him quiet. It had worked perfectly. "Ethan," she said, her voice gentle but firm, pulling him back to the present. "We can fix this. We can tell the truth now." A spark of life returned to his eyes. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. He slid it across the table. It was a map, drawn in a boy's unsteady hand with colored pencils. A map of the rail yard. It was beautifully detailed, with little cartoon skulls marking dangerous areas and notes about loose fence panels. And there, on a forgotten siding near the edge of the property, was a big red X. "We drew it together the week before," Ethan whispered. "That's the car. That's where he found them. A piece of physical evidence, a map, an eyewitness." The hope was no longer a fragile sprout. It was a tree, strong and solid, reaching for the sky. She felt a surge of adrenaline, of purpose. "Help me, Ethan," she pleaded, her hand covering his on top of the map. "Help me find them. We can go back, before they tear it all down." For the first time, Ethan looked her directly in the eye. He saw her determination, her unwavering belief. He saw a chance, after a lifetime of running, to finally stand still and fight. And he nodded. The high of their alliance was exhilarating. For the rest of the day, Claire felt invincible. She had a witness. She had a map. Justice felt not just possible but inevitable. They made a plan to go to the yard the following night, under the cover of darkness, before the demolition crews arrived. But the forces working against them were older, darker, and more patient than she could have ever imagined. That evening, as Claire sat at home, studying a satellite image of the rail yard and trying to match it to Ethan's hand-drawn map, her phone rang. It was Ethan. He was supposed to be at home, resting, preparing for their search, but he wasn't. He was whispering, and behind him, she could hear the wind and the distant sound of crickets. He was outside. "Claire," he stammered, his voice tight with a fresh wave of panic. "Someone was here, at my house." "What do you mean, Ethan? What happened?" "My tires," he said, his breathing ragged. "I went out to my truck, all 4 of them. They've been slashed, sliced right through the sidewalls. There's a note on the windshield." "What does it say?" she asked, a cold dread washing over her. She already knew the answer. Ethan took a shaky breath. "It just says one word," he whispered. "Silent." They knew. They knew he had talked. The warning wasn't just for him, it was for her. It was Vernon Hale, or whoever worked for him, sending a clear, brutal message. They had been silent for 22 years, and they had every intention of making sure it stayed that way. The hope that had soared so high just hours before crashed to the earth, shattering into a million pieces. The game had changed. This wasn't about uncovering a long-lost secret anymore. This was a war. And they had just made their first move. The slashed tires were a declaration of war. Ethan was terrified, retreating back into the shell of silence he had inhabited for 22 years. He wouldn't answer his phone. He wouldn't come to his door. The fragile alliance Claire had built was shattered by a single violent act of intimidation. She was alone again. But now she knew exactly who her enemy was. Vernon Hale. The name was no longer a phantom. It was a face, a voice, a position of power in their town. She started watching him. She attended town council meetings, sitting in the back row, observing the man who had built a career on the foundations of a lie. On the surface, he was everything a small-town politician should be: charming, articulate, and deeply concerned with the welfare of his constituents. He spoke about the upcoming railyard demolition not as a construction project, but as a healing. "It's time to finally close this painful chapter for our community," he said at one meeting, his voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. "By clearing this old wound from our landscape, we can finally begin to move forward, to build a safer, brighter future for our children." The crowd of older residents nodded, captivated by his performance. They saw a leader. Claire saw a monster. She noticed his tell. Whenever he was challenged, whenever he was delivering a particularly egregious lie, he had a habit. He would pause mid-sentence, remove his immaculate eyeglasses, and begin polishing them with a small silk handkerchief he kept in his breast pocket. It was a subtle, calming gesture, a way of buying himself a moment to compose his next deception. He did it when a woman complained about the demolition contract going to his brother-in-law's company. He did it when another resident questioned the sudden rush to get the project started before the Historical Society could object. And he did it when he saw Claire. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a split second, the mask of the benevolent public servant slipped. She saw a flicker of cold, reptilian awareness. He knew who she was. He knew what she was doing. He didn't stop his speech. He just smoothly pulled out the handkerchief, wiped his lenses with a deliberate, almost insolent slowness, and then put them back on, his gaze never leaving hers. It was a message, as clear and sharp as the blade that had cut through Ethan's tires. "I see you, and I can erase you." The absolute arrogance of it, the quiet public threat, made Claire's blood run cold, but it also filled her with a white-hot rage. "You feel it too, don't you? That feeling when someone in power thinks they are so untouchable they can threaten you with a look. It makes you want to tear down their whole world." Claire knew that direct confrontation was useless. He was too insulated, too beloved. She had to find something concrete, something official, something he couldn't dismiss as the hysterical ramblings of a troubled woman. She needed proof. She needed the original police reports, the witness statements, the documents from 1990 that had been sealed away in the town archives. Getting access to them was supposed to be a matter of public record, but she quickly found out that some records were more public than others. The clerk at the town hall, a woman with a permanently pursed expression, informed her that all records pertaining to the Reed case were sealed by judicial order. When Claire pressed, asking who ordered it, the clerk simply pointed to a framed photograph on her desk. It was of her and Vernon Hale at a charity pancake breakfast, both of them beaming. Hale's control over this town was absolute. He had spent 2 decades building walls around his secret, and they were made of loyalty, bureaucracy, and fear. That night, the fight became personal. It was no longer just about the Reed brothers. It was about her own family. Her teenage daughter, Maya, found her hunched over her laptop at midnight, surrounded by printouts of old newspaper articles and satellite maps of the railyard. Maya's face, usually so full of youthful energy, was tight with worry. "Mom, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice small. "Mrs. Gable from next door said you were causing trouble. She said you upset Mr. Reed at the memorial." Claire's heart sank. The poison was spreading, seeping into her own home. She tried to explain, to make her daughter understand the importance of the truth, of honoring a promise. But Maya wasn't a child anymore. She saw the exhaustion in her mother's eyes, the new, hunted look she carried with her everywhere. "This isn't safe," Maya pleaded, her own eyes filling with tears. "That man, mister? Hale, he's powerful. Everyone is afraid of him. I'm afraid for you. Please, Mom. Just stop, let it go. It's not your fight." Every word was a knife in Claire's heart. Her own daughter, the person she loved most in the world, was asking her to quit, to be a coward. The instinct to protect her child, to pull back and retreat to safety, was overwhelming. She almost gave in. She almost promised to stop. But then she looked at the grainy photo of the Reed brothers on her screen. They had been children too, with a mother who loved them. Giving up now wouldn't just be breaking her promise to Daniel. It would be teaching her own daughter that fear always wins, that powerful men always get to write the history books. She couldn't do that. That night, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of love, anger, and utter desperation, Claire made another reckless choice. You're shaking your head, aren't you? You're telling her that this is how people get hurt, by letting their emotions overrule their common sense. But you also understand that sometimes the most important battles are fought with the heart, not the head. She waited until Maya was asleep. She put on dark clothes, grabbed a small flashlight, and slipped out of her own house like a thief in the night. The town hall was a silent, imposing block of stone in the moonlight, but she knew a way in. A loose window in the basement, one the high school kids used to use to sneak into the gym. She hadn't thought about it in 25 years. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the latch. The air inside was cold and smelled of stale paper and floor wax. Every creak of the old building was a thunderclap in the silence. She navigated by memory, her flashlight beam, a frantic, bouncing eye in the darkness, until she found the archives room. The door was locked, of course, a modern, heavy-duty lock. But beside it, hanging on a hook labeled janitorial, was a ring of keys, a stupid, careless oversight, or maybe a trap. She didn't care. She found the right key. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire building. Inside, metal shelves stretched up into the darkness, lined with hundreds of identical cardboard boxes. It was a graveyard of the town's secrets. She found the section for 1990 and started pulling down boxes, her breath coming in ragged, dusty gasps. And then she found it. A box thicker than the others, with a red stamp on the side. Read, DMC, sealed, VH. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was all there. Witness interviews, crime scene photos she had never seen, the initial police reports. Her flashlight beam fell across a page, and she started taking pictures with her phone, one frantic shot after another, capturing the forbidden words. She was so focused, so consumed by the discovery, that she didn't hear the soft scrape of a shoe on the linoleum in the hallway. She didn't hear the quiet turn of a key in the lock. It was only when she went to leave, her phone full of photographic evidence, that she discovered the door wouldn't open. She was trapped. A moment later, the main lights in the hallway flickered on, flooding the room through the small glass window in the door, and a figure stepped into view. It wasn't a security guard. It was the pursed-lipped town clerk, a smug, triumphant look on her face. And standing just behind her, half hidden in the shadows, was Vernon Hale. He wasn't smiling. He was just watching her, his face a calm, placid mask of victory. The trap had been sprung. Humiliation was a far colder cage than the archives room. Vernon Hale didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He was much, much crueler than that. He simply stood on the other side of the glass, a look of profound disappointment on his face, as if Claire were a student who had let him down. The town police chief, a man Claire had known since kindergarten, was summoned. He unlocked the door and escorted her out, his face a careful, unreadable mask. They took her phone, deleting the photos she had risked everything to get. Hale, in a masterstroke of political theater, declined to press charges for breaking and entering. "She's a grieving woman," he told the police chief, loud enough for Claire to hear. "Clearly she's not well. Let's not add a criminal record to her troubles." The condescension was suffocating. He wasn't punishing her with the law. He was punishing her with pity, painting her as unstable, an object of concern rather than a threat. She was released with a formal warning and a temporary ban from all municipal buildings. She had been caught, disarmed, and publicly dismissed as a hysteric in one clean, brutal motion. Walking home in the gray light of dawn, she had never felt so defeated. The hope she'd felt holding those files in her hands had been incinerated, leaving nothing but the cold ash of failure. For 2 days, Claire did nothing. She stayed home, curtains drawn, ignoring the concerned calls from Lydia and the worried texts from Maya. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. Hale had won. He had outplayed her at every turn. Her reckless gambit in the archives had only served to solidify his power and discredit her completely. The online forum that had once been a source of support was now turning against her, the story of her breakdown at the town hall having been anonymously leaked and spread with vicious speed. She was losing on all fronts. Then, on the 3rd day, a package arrived. It was a small, square box wrapped in brown paper, with no return address. Her first instinct was fear. Was it another threat? A warning? Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a book. It was an old leather-bound volume, the kind with marbled end papers and a faded gold title on the spine, A History of the Northwood Rail Line. Tucked inside the front cover was a note, written in a shaky, elderly hand she recognized instantly. Some things are better left buried, but some people dig anyway. Page 94. It was from Mr. Abernathy. The old teacher who had warned her away, who had been too afraid to speak, had found a different way to help. He had sent her a weapon. With a fresh surge of adrenaline, Claire flipped to page 94. It was a dry, technical chapter about the decommissioning process for old train cars in the late 80s and early 90s. It was full of jargon, part numbers, and company policy. And then she saw it. Tucked into a dense paragraph was a mention of a retired clerk, a man named Joseph Albright, who had been responsible for maintaining the final decommission ledgers, the official records of every single car that was taken out of service and sent for scrap. He had retired just a few years ago. He was still alive. It was a long shot, a wild, desperate hope, but it was all she had. Finding him wasn't hard. His name was in the phone book. He lived in a nursing home one town over, a place that smelled of antiseptic and regret. Joseph Albright was a frail man, his memories a flickering candle in the wind. But when Claire mentioned the decommissioned ledgers from 1990, a flicker of clarity returned to his rheumy eyes. "The red books," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "I kept them all, even after they told me to shred 'em. Can't throw away history." He explained that when he retired he had taken the ledgers home with him. He saw them as his life's work, and he couldn't bear to see them destroyed. With a trembling hand, he gave Claire his daughter's phone number and told her to ask for the red books in the attic. The ledger was a revelation. It was a huge, heavy book, its pages filled with neat columns of handwritten numbers and dates. It was the rail yard's entire life story written in ink. Claire sat at her kitchen table with Ethan's hand-drawn map on one side and the ledger on the other, her heart pounding with a rhythm that was equal parts hope and terror. She began to cross-reference the numbers of the cars scheduled for scrap during the first week of October 1990 against the cars still visible on satellite images of the yard. One by one, she accounted for them, all except one. A single car number, listed in the ledger as decommissioned and scrapped on October 8, 1990, was missing from the inventory. Car number 734, a standard sealed boxcar. According to this official document, it had been destroyed 22 years ago. Claire's hands trembled as she looked at Ethan's map. She followed the lines he had drawn as a boy, her finger tracing the path to the forgotten siding he had marked with a big red X, and right next to that X was a crudely drawn boxcar. Underneath it, he had written a number, 734. The car wasn't destroyed, it was still there. It had been there this whole time. This was it. The final, undeniable proof. A missing car, a secret location on a map, and a 22-year-old lie recorded in an official ledger. The feeling was electric, a jolt of pure, triumphant certainty that lit up every nerve in her body. They were so close. That evening, a storm rolled in, a violent, angry tempest that lashed the town with wind and rain. Claire knew she had to get to Ethan to show him what she'd found. The demolition was scheduled to start in less than 48 hours. They were out of time. Ignoring Maya's pleas to stay home, to wait out the storm, Claire got in her car and headed for Ethan's house. The rain was coming down in blinding sheets, the wind shaking her small car. She was driving down the old winding road that led out of town, her mind racing with what they would do next, how they would use this information to finally force the truth out into the open. As she came around a sharp, unlit curve, she pressed her foot on the brake to slow down. Nothing happened. She pressed it again, harder this time, jamming the pedal all the way to the floor. The car didn't slow. If anything, it seemed to pick up speed. A wave of icy terror washed over her. The brakes were gone. The car was accelerating into the turn, hurtling toward the flimsy guardrail that separated the road from a steep, wooded ravine. The world dissolved into a terrifying blur of rain, headlights, and raw, primal panic. She wrenched the wheel, trying to steer into the skid, but it was too late. The car slammed into the guardrail with a deafening shriek of tearing metal. For a single, horrifying second, the car teetered on the edge, balanced between the road and the abyss, and then it plunged into the darkness. She was falling, tumbling through the black, stormy night, the world a violent cacophony of shattering glass and collapsing steel. This was how it ended. Hale had escalated from threats to sabotage, from intimidation to murder. And as her world went black, her last conscious thought was of the Reed boys, and the secret that was about to die with her in the rain. Consciousness returned not as a light, but as a pain, a deep, throbbing ache in her head, and a chorus of smaller, sharper pains all over her body. The smell of rain-soaked earth and leaking gasoline filled her senses. Claire was hanging upside down, held in place only by her seatbelt, the world a disorienting, shattered mess outside the broken driver's side window. By some miracle, the car had been caught in the thick branches of an old oak tree, suspending it 10 feet above the rocky bottom of the ravine. She was alive. Bruised, battered, and terrified, but alive. The crash hadn't been an accident. She knew that with a certainty that cut through the fog of her concussion. This was a message from Hale, a final, brutal warning. For a long, terrifying hour, she stayed there, listening to the storm rage around her, her hope draining away with the rain dripping on her face. Her daughter's tear-streaked face flashed in her mind. "Please, Mom, just stop." Maya had been right. This was too dangerous. It wasn't her fight. Not anymore. She was done. But as the storm began to subside, a new sound cut through the night. The crunch of gravel. The low rumble of a truck engine. Headlights sliced through the trees, sweeping across her wrecked car. It wasn't help. It was him. A figure got out of the truck and walked to the edge of the ravine, a powerful flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Even from this distance, she recognized the silhouette. Ethan. He hadn't run. He had seen the emergency lights from his house, had known instantly what it meant, and he had come. When he saw her, hanging in the wreckage, a raw, anguished cry escaped his lips. The guilt he had carried for 22 years, the shame of the boy who ran, had been transformed into a man's resolve. He wasn't running this time. He was her only hope. He helped her climb out of the mangled car, his hands surprisingly strong and steady. When she was safely on the road, wrapped in a blanket from his truck, the dam of her composure finally broke. She wept. Not just for the fear, but for the profound, overwhelming relief of not being alone. His presence was an anchor in the storm of her despair. "He tried to kill you," Ethan said, his voice a low, hard growl she had never heard from him before. There was no fear in it now, only a cold, hard fury. "Because of this," he held up his hand, drawn map. "Because we know. We can't stop now, Claire. We can't let him win. Not after this. The demolition starts tomorrow at dawn." The desperation was a living thing between them. It was now or never. They didn't call the police. Who would they trust? The same chief who had looked the other way for 2 decades. No, this was something they had to do themselves. They drove Ethan's truck to the rail yard, parking it half a mile away and approaching the perimeter fence on foot. The moon was a sliver of bone behind the clouds. The air was cold and clean after the storm. The fence, once an insurmountable barrier, now felt like a minor obstacle. They slipped under the same section Gus had shown her, their movements quick and silent, fueled by adrenaline and a shared, desperate purpose. Inside, the rail yard was even more menacing at night, a labyrinth of black, silent steel. But they had the map. Ethan, the boy who had once sketched this place for fun, now led them through it with the confidence of a seasoned guide. "This way," he'd whisper, pointing with a flashlight that cut a nervous, bouncing path in front of them. "The siding is just past the water tower." And then they saw it, tucked away behind a line of decaying tanker cars, covered in 22 years of weeds and rust, was a single, sealed boxcar. Number 734. It was exactly where the map said it would be. It looked like any other abandoned car, but it felt different. It felt like a tomb. It pulsed with a cold, silent energy. They were standing on the edge of the truth. The door was sealed shut not just by rust, but by a thick, heavy-duty chain, secured with a massive, industrial padlock that was far newer than the rest of the car. Someone had made very, very sure this door would never be opened. They had come prepared. Ethan pulled a crowbar and a pair of bolt cutters from a duffel bag. The sound of the cutters biting into the hardened steel of the padlock was obscenely loud in the graveyard silence. It echoed off the sides of the other train cars like a gunshot. Every snap of the metal made Claire jump, her eyes scanning the darkness, convinced that at any moment headlights would appear and Vernon Hale's men would descend upon them. But no one came. With a final, groaning snap, the chain fell away. Now only the door remained. It was rusted shut, fused to its frame by time and neglect. Together, they wedged the crowbar into the seam and pushed. The metal screamed in protest, a long, agonizing shriek that grated on their nerves. They put all their weight into it, their muscles straining, sweat beading on their foreheads despite the cold night air. And then, with a final, shuddering crack, the seal broke. The door slid open just enough for them to slip inside. The air that poured out of the car was cold and stale, the smell of dust and trapped time. Claire hesitated on the threshold, her heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm. What would they find? What horror had been waiting in this dark, silent place for 2 decades? You are right there with her, holding your breath, bracing for the worst. You can feel the cold metal under her hands, smell the musty air. This is the moment of truth. She took a deep breath, aimed her flashlight into the blackness, and stepped inside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene that was both heartbreakingly ordinary and deeply, profoundly wrong. There were no bodies, there were no signs of a struggle. Instead, sitting in a neat, orderly pile in the center of the car, were the last remnants of 3 boys' lives. 3 backpacks, their canvas faded and dusty. A worn Wilson baseball glove, and sitting on top of the pile, a small black Polaroid camera. The flashlight beam trembled in Claire's hand. This wasn't a tomb, it was a time capsule. She knelt down, her hand reaching out to touch one of the backpacks. It was Daniel's. She could still see the faded ink where he had drawn the logo of his favorite band on the front flap. The grief was a physical blow, so sharp and sudden it knocked the air from her lungs. She fell to her knees and began to sob, touching the objects as if they were holy relics, her tears dripping onto 22 years of dust. Suddenly, the night was shattered by the glare of powerful headlights. A truck screeched to a halt just outside the open door of the boxcar, pinning them in its blinding beams. Figures spilled out, their faces hidden in the shadows behind the lights. And then, a familiar voice cut through the air, calm, controlled, and dripping with menace. "Well, well, look what we have here." Vernon Hale stepped into the doorway of the car, his silhouette blocking their only escape. He wasn't wearing his politician's suit now. He was dressed in work clothes, his face a cold mask of fury. He looked at Ethan, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. "I thought we had an understanding, son," he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "I thought I told you to stay silent, just like before." Then he turned his gaze to Claire, who was still kneeling amidst the boys' belongings. He gestured to the 2 burly men who had flanked him. "Get them out of here, and get rid of her." One of the men grabbed Ethan, twisting his arm behind his back. The other lunged for Claire. In the chaos, her hand closed around the only thing she could reach, the Polaroid camera. As the man dragged her out of the car and shoved her toward the darkness, she clutched it to her chest, the hard plastic corners digging into her ribs. It was all she had left. She was forced to run, to scramble into the night, the mocking laughter of Vernon Hale echoing behind her. She had found the truth, only to have it snatched away at the last possible second. And now, he knew she had found it, and he was never going to let her tell it. She ran through the woods like a hunted animal, branches tearing at her clothes and skin, the shouts of Hale's men fading behind her. She didn't stop until the rail yard was a distant memory, and the familiar lights of her own neighborhood were in sight. Stumbling into her house, she locked the door, leaned against it, and slid to the floor, her body trembling with a toxic mix of terror and failure. They had found the boys' last sanctuary, a place untouched for 22 years, and Hale had ripped it away from them in a matter of minutes. He had Ethan. He had the boxcar. He would sanitize the scene, destroy the evidence, and by morning it would be as if nothing had ever been found. He had won, utterly. It was over. She was sobbing, a deep guttural sound of complete and total despair, when she felt the hard, rectangular shape still pressed against her ribs. The camera. In the chaos, in the frantic, terrifying escape, she had managed to hold on to the Polaroid camera. It was a pathetic consolation prize, a broken, useless toy, a final, cruel joke. She almost threw it against the wall, a gesture of pure, impotent rage. But something stopped her. Some small, quiet instinct. With fumbling, bruised fingers, she opened the back of the camera, and her heart stopped. There, still loaded inside, was a cartridge of film. It was ancient, probably ruined by time and the damp air of the boxcar. But it was there. Hope, she was learning, was a stubborn, impossible weed. No matter how many times it was cut down, it found a way to grow back in the most unlikely of places. Finding a place to develop 22-year-old Polaroid film was a desperate, almost comical challenge. The world had moved on, but Lydia, her steadfast, loyal friend, knew a guy. An old wedding photographer who still kept a darkroom in his basement, a man who loved the lost art of chemical photography. They met him in a hushed, almost clandestine meeting, the camera passing between them like a state secret. The photographer was skeptical. "This film is ancient," he warned. "The emulsion is probably shot. Don't get your hopes up." For an hour, Claire and Lydia sat in the photographer's musty living room, the silence stretching taut with unbearable suspense. It was a silence filled with 22 years of unspoken questions. When he finally emerged from the basement, he was holding a single, still-developing photograph. He laid it on the coffee table, and they watched as the milky gray chemicals slowly, magically resolved into an image. At first, it was just a blur of colors, a mess of indistinct shapes. Then, faces began to appear, and Claire let out a gasp so sharp it was almost a scream. It was them. Daniel, Matthew, and Christopher Reed, alive and grinning. They were squeezed together, arms around each other's shoulders, looking straight at the camera. They were happy. They were safe. They were just three boys on an adventure. But it wasn't their faces that made Claire's blood run cold. It was what was behind them. In the background of the photo, partially obscured by a tree, but still unmistakably there, was a vehicle. A dark green Ford pickup truck, the kind with a white camper shell. And leaning against the driver's side door, half turned away from the camera, was a man in a work shirt, Vernon Hale. The photograph wasn't just a picture of the boys, it was proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof that Hale had been there that day, with them, in the rail yard. He hadn't just stumbled upon them. The context of the photo suggested he was with them, that they weren't afraid of him. Not yet. The single, miraculous photograph changed everything. It was no longer her word against a powerful politician's. It was Hale's own image, captured by the very boys he had silenced. But what did it prove? That he was there, yes, but not what happened next. The image was a beginning, not an end. It was then that Claire remembered Gus Miller, the retired rail worker who had been threatened into silence. He had been a union man, loyal to his brothers on the line. He knew the rail yard's secrets. Hale had threatened his pension and his family. But this photograph, this might be enough to make a good man break a promise made under duress. She found him at a union hall meeting, a weekly gathering of retired workers who met to drink cheap coffee and complain about the modern world. She showed him the photo. At first, his face was a hard, angry mask. He didn't want to see it. He didn't want to be involved. But he couldn't look away from the boys' smiling faces. He stared at the picture for a long, silent minute. "That green truck," he finally whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That was Hale's. He drove it for years." He looked up at Claire, and the fear in his eyes was still there, but now it was mixed with a shame that was even more powerful. "He used to cover things up," Gus said, the words spilling out in a rush, as if a dam had finally broken. "Safety violations, minor accidents. Kid gets a broken arm sneaking in, Hale would give the family a couple $100 and make the report disappear. He was protecting the company, but he was really protecting himself, building his reputation. The Reed boys, they weren't the first, you see. They were just the ones who disappeared. The scale of Hale's deception was staggering. This wasn't just about one tragic day. It was a pattern. A decades-long cover-up of yard accidents involving trespassing children, all swept under the rug by a man ruthlessly building his political career on a false platform of safety and order. He hadn't just silenced the story of the Reed brothers. He had erased the stories of countless other children who had been hurt in that yard. The revelation gave Claire the courage for her next move. She went to Ethan's house. She didn't know what she would find. Would he be gone, or worse? But when she knocked on the door, he answered. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, but he was standing. He was alive. He told her Hale's men had roughed him up, driven him out to the edge of the county, and dumped him with a final warning: disappear for good, or his family would be next. For 22 years, fear had been Ethan's prison. But seeing Claire standing on his porch, battered but not broken, holding a photograph that spoke the truth he had been too terrified to utter, something inside him finally snapped. The shame of his silence was now a heavier burden than the fear of speaking. "He can't keep doing this," Ethan said, his voice raw but steady. "He can't keep hurting people to protect himself. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything I saw." In that moment, the boy who ran was gone forever, replaced by a man who was ready to stand his ground. Claire now had a witness and a photograph. It was time to go public, but not to the police and not to the local paper, both of which were firmly in Hale's pocket. She sent the photo and a summary of Gus's story to a hard-nosed investigative reporter at a major state newspaper, a woman known for her relentless pursuit of corrupt politicians. The story exploded. But Vernon Hale was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. The morning the story broke, just as the entire state was seeing his face in a picture with the 3 boys he swore he barely knew, Claire was served with a lawsuit. Vernon Hale was suing her for defamation, for libel, for emotional distress. He was using the last weapon he had left, the legal system. He was going to bury her in motions, depositions, and legal fees. He was going to bankrupt her, discredit her, and drag her name through the mud until no one would ever believe a word she said. The lawsuit was a brilliant, vicious move. It wasn't about winning in court, it was about silencing her through attrition. Just when she thought she had him, just when the truth was finally about to see the light of day, he had found a way to plunge her back into the darkness, threatening to take everything she had left. Hale's lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal warfare. It choked the momentum of the news story, turning the narrative from a question of his guilt into a debate about Claire's credibility. He was no longer the villain in the photo, he was the respected public servant, a victim of a malicious, unstable woman's crusade. The pressure on Claire was immense. Her savings evaporated into a retainer for a lawyer who looked at her with pitying eyes. Neighbors who had started to whisper their support in the grocery store now crossed the street to avoid her. She was being bled dry, financially and emotionally. The demolition of the rail yard, which had been briefly paused due to the media attention, was now scheduled to resume, a final concrete and steel exclamation point on Hale's victory. The night before the final town hearing, a formality to approve the demolition, Claire sat in her kitchen, a mountain of legal bills on the table, feeling the last of her fight drain out of her. You can feel her exhaustion, can't you? The crushing weight of fighting a system that is designed to protect men like Hale. You want to reach through the screen and tell her to keep going, but you also understand why she would want to surrender. But the seeds of truth, once planted, have a way of taking root in the most unexpected soil. The news story, the lawsuit, the photograph, it had all created a groundswell of doubt in the town that Hale could no longer control, and it had reached the one person whose heart had been the most closed off. That evening there was a knock on Claire's door. It was Thomas Reed, the boy's father, the man who had publicly shamed her, who had snatched the whistle from her hand. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked broken. His face was a roadmap of a grief so old and deep it had become a part of his bones. He stood on her porch, twisting his hat in his hands, unable to meet her eyes. "I need to see it," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The picture. I need to see their faces." Claire led him inside and laid the Polaroid on the kitchen table. He stared at it, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the image of his smiling sons. And for the first time in 22 years, Thomas Reed allowed himself to weep. Not the silent, stoic tears of a man standing at a memorial, but the racking, soul-shattering sobs of a father who had just been given a final, beautiful, terrible gift. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words catching in his throat. "I was so afraid. I thought, if I hoped, if I let myself believe they could have been found, the pain would be too much to bear all over again. It was easier to believe they were just gone." His confession wasn't just an apology, it was a release. He had finally let go of the brittle anger he had used as a shield, and in its place was a father's pure, devastating love. His belief, his support, was a validation that was worth more than any legal victory. The town hearing was a standing-room-only affair. It wasn't just a bureaucratic meeting anymore. It was the final act of a 22-year-old drama. The air in the room was thick with tension, a palpable current of anger, grief, and desperate curiosity. Vernon Hale sat at the head of the council table, the picture of calm, polished authority. He opened the meeting with a smooth, practiced speech about progress and healing, his voice a soothing balm of practiced lies. He even had the gall to call Claire out by name, expressing his sincere sympathy for her ongoing struggles, and his hope that the demolition would bring her the closure she so clearly needs. The arrogance was breathtaking. He was performing his own innocence, confident that he had already won. He paused, pulled out his silk handkerchief, and began to polish his glasses. It was the move of a predator, comfortable and in control. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had forgotten about the boy who ran. Just as Hale was about to call for the vote, a figure rose from the back of the room. It was Ethan Miller. His face was still bruised, but he walked toward the podium with a slow, deliberate stride that commanded the attention of the entire room. A hush fell. Hale's hands, in the middle of wiping his lenses, froze. This was not part of his plan. "My name is Ethan Miller," he began, his voice shaking but clear, amplified by the microphone. "And 22 years ago, I was a coward." He looked directly at Hale, and for the first time he did not flinch. "I was in the rail yard on October 6, 1990. I was with Daniel, Matthew, and Christopher Reed." Gasps rippled through the crowd. This was it, the moment of truth. Ethan recounted the entire story, the dare, the sealed car, and the sudden, terrifying appearance of Vernon Hale. As he spoke, Claire, sitting in the front row, placed the Polaroid photograph on an overhead projector. The image of the three smiling boys, with Hale and his green truck in the background, filled a massive screen behind the council table. It loomed over Hale's head like a judgment. The murmurs in the crowd grew into a low, angry roar. Hale's face, which had been a mask of calm composure, began to crumble. The blood drained from his cheeks. His tell, the polishing of the glasses, was forgotten. He was exposed, stripped bare in front of the very people whose trust he had cultivated for decades. The room turned on him. People who had been his staunchest supporters were now shouting questions, their faces contorted with betrayal. "Is it true, Vernon? Were you there? What did you do to those boys?" The shield of his authority, built over a lifetime of lies, shattered in an instant. The police chief, the same man who had escorted Claire from the town hall, now stood up, his face grim, and walked toward the council table. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at Hale. The tide had turned. Justice, which had been a distant, impossible dream, was finally beginning. In the ensuing chaos, Vernon Hale was removed from his seat, and the state police were called in to launch a full investigation. The demolition of the rail yard was halted indefinitely, the site declared a potential crime scene. The boxcar, number 734, was sealed off, not as a hiding place, but as a memorial to the truth that had finally been unearthed. The resolution, when it came, was bittersweet. The bodies of the Reed brothers were never found. The full story of what happened after Hale grabbed Daniel's arm on that October afternoon died with the secret he would now take to prison. He had never intended to harm them, he claimed in a desperate, last-ditch plea. There had been an accident, a struggle, and in the ensuing panic, he had made a terrible choice to hide his involvement, a choice that had snowballed into a lifetime of lies. But their story was finally told. Their names were cleared of the quiet shame that had clung to them, the unspoken suggestion that they were reckless boys who had gotten themselves lost. They were victims. And their killer was no longer a pillar of the community. He was a disgraced man, his legacy reduced to a single damning photograph. Weeks later, Claire stood with Thomas Reed at the rail-yard fence. The memorial plaque from the park had been moved here, to the place where his sons had last been alive. He was no longer the brittle, angry man consumed by waiting. The truth, as painful as it was, had set him free. He reached out and squeezed Claire's shoulder. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with tears. "Now I can stop waiting at the window." His words were a gift, a final, quiet absolution. The final image of their story is not one of victory parades or cheering crowds. It is a quiet, simple one. It is of Claire, alone at the fence, placing the rusted train whistle on the ground at the foot of the memorial. She had kept her promise. The truth was out, and the last whistle, after 22 long years of silence, had finally been heard.